This hour we're going to talk about the house church concept. The house church concept is loosely defined approach to religion that says smaller is better. It calls for less organization to religion that says smaller is better. It talks about the fact that they don't want to have the formal worship. They want more spontaneity. They don't want any church building. They don't want any staff members like secretaries. And no youth ministers, which I wouldn't have a problem with that. All the men take turn preaching, and the sermons are composed of an informal reading of the scriptures followed by some comments and or exchange of ideas. In other words, they just read the scripture, everybody gets to say what they want to say about it, and then they go on. I've seen Bible classes that way. Guy gets up, reads a verse, what do y'all think about that? Everybody says what they think about it, then he reads another verse. Kind of just sad state of affairs. Nothing really gets taught, but a lot of assertions are made, a lot of opinions are stated. Now, that type of preaching means that there's no preachers and no sermons. A lot of brethren would say, hallelujah. Right? The house church says that it will not be a growing congregation. In other words, when one house church gets too big, some of those brethren go and start another one. In other words, they're intended to be a small group of people meeting in somebody's home. And that's all they want. They don't want a big congregation of a lot of people. Get too big, you just branch out and start another house church. There are no church treasuries in the house church. In the house church, the Lord's Supper is taken in connection with a common meal. Children are encouraged to partake of the Lord's Supper as well. There's no name for the church, and it seems like, in at least some cases, every man gets to be an elder. How about that? No qualifications. So just take turns being elders. And a lot of this stems from denominational concepts. Okay? Now, a lot of this, when we talk about house church concept, it originated in denominationalism, and like everything else, because we don't pay attention and we don't guard against these things, like Brother said, it starts creeping into the church. And then we got a problem, and we have to deal with it. Rather than be aware, a lot of congregations, I've talked to elders at various congregations in the past and said, hey, what about these issues that are going on, brothers? We don't have a problem with that here. We're not going to talk about it. Guess what? Now they have a problem with that because they refuse to talk about it. We can't hide our head in the sand. That's what brothers get. We can't fight the battle, win the battle, and then just turn our back on it and walk away. We've got to make sure it doesn't resurrect and come back. Liberalism has a bad tendency to raise its ugly head every so often. And we have to be ready. We have to be on guard. We need lessons and lectureships like this to help us know what's out there, what the issues are, and how to defend against them. Okay? If not, we're just prey for liberalism or atheism, whichever way you want to go. All right, so there's no name for the church. It seems like at least at some point all the men get to be elders. There does not seem to be much emphasis on doing all things by divine authority, and there does seem to be a tendency to assume what needs to be proven. For example, some proponents of the house church idea are dogmatic when they say that the early church met in homes, and that is the pattern for New Testament Christianity throughout all the ages. In fact, we're going to find that some say that we haven't restored the church until we return to that. All right? So when we think about this, at this point I want to distinct that sound brethren are not opposed to brothers and sisters visiting with one another in someone's home. We're not talking about that. We're not opposed to studying the Bible together with a handful of people or with a large group. We are not opposed to eating a meal together and encouraging and exhorting one another and praying together. We're not opposed to that. In fact, I remember a lot of times in the 30 years that I've been preaching with various congregations in several different states, times when we've met in people's homes and had meals, studied the Bible, sang hymns, and just encouraged one another. And so we're not talking about those kinds of things. We're not opposed to these things, but rather we really endorse them and encourage them. In fact, the house church movement may very well be the fad of the moment. And it's interesting how these things cycle. I remember back in the 70s and early 80s, we had the denominations were big into the bus ministry. Remember that? Okay, by about the time they figured out that it was more trouble than it was of value, our brethren decided, hey man, look what they're doing. We need to do that. And so guess what we did? We bought their old buses that they're trying to get rid of because they don't want them anymore. And so then we start a bus ministry. And we go around, and I remember one woman was saying, I drive the bus. And I was on the bubblegum run. That's exactly what she said. I was on the bubblegum run. And then she started talking about how that they would compete. That each the denominations would have a bus, and they would have a bus, and she would give bubble gum, and then here the denomination would come and give them cookies, and then she would give them something else, and then the denomination would start taking them to McDonald's, and they were competing for kids to get on their bus, right? There's nothing scriptural about that. But guess what? Finally, we fill the bus with little kids. And we bring them to the assembly, maybe 15 or 20 unsupervised children that have never been to the worship assembly in their life. And you know how they act, right? So let's have children's church. See how that stuff works? We do one thing, maybe it was a good idea, had good intentions, that led to a problem, and when we try to solve that problem, what? We go beyond the scriptures. But see, there's all kinds of things that are going on that lead to violating the principles that are laid down in the New Testament regarding our assemblies, our worship together. All right. So the house church movement may be a fad, like I said. About 5% of Americans say that they attend a house church or a simple church which is not associated with any local congregation or type of church. It goes on to say some are seeking house churches because they are tired of tradition. Others because they are tired of organized worship. Some feel that the Lord's church is steeped in tired, worn-out practices that lack warmth, depth, intimacy, unity, and excitement. See, that's the way some people view our worship. When we come together and we're solemn, and we're respectful, we're reverent, and we sing praises to God the way they think that that's just tired and worn out and old-fashioned. And it's cold and unloving. We're not united. The house church to them is just the ticket to turn their interest and enthusiasm to religion. So they're doing this with what they think are good intentions. They think there's a problem with the way things are going in the Lord's church, and so they want to change it. I'm here to tell you, friends and brethren, having dealt with these types of issues for 30 years, there are people that have been raised all of their life in the Lord's church, and they hate it. They can't stand it. They don't like anything about it, and they want to change it. This is just one example of what they've come up with to change the church because they don't like what the New Testament set out as the authorized pattern for New Testament Christianity. They don't like it. Some people don't like America, and they're trying to change the fundamental way America works. See, the same principle goes for the church. Don't like the church, we just change it. You know, there's one thing about not liking what's in America. We have the right as citizens to speak our voice and say, this is the way I want it to be. We need to correspond to the Constitution and make sure that the changes we want to make are constitutional. Just like if we see problems in the Lord's church, we want to make sure that the changes that we want to see happen are scriptural. They're according to the pattern. There's nothing to say that we can't change items of opinion. We can change those all we want, as long as we make sure that the change is for the better, right? Expedient, that's what expedience is. But if we don't like the doctrine of the New Testament pattern for Christianity, we don't have a right to change that. We have more right as citizens of the United States to amend the Constitution than we have as Christians to change what the Scriptures say. We can amend the Constitution. We cannot amend New Testament Christianity. Well, we're supposed to submit to it. John Mark Hicks, false teacher associated with David Lipscomb University, wrote a book entitled Come to the Table. That it's had a lot of influence on the house church movement. So there's books written promoting this by so-called members of the Lord's church. Obviously not a faithful member, hasn't been for years. He's been behind a lot of efforts to change Christianity for decades. Another man, Lectureship Smith, another false teacher, is the author of a book called Radical Restoration, which, according to reviews, calls for house churches as one significant ingredient to restoring primitive New Testament Christianity. And so he has a lengthy chapter on this very subject in his book. When we think about this effort to remake the Lord's church, make sure to remember what the church is from our previous lesson, the idea of the assembly, right? All the brethren in one location come together in one place, right? The church at Corinth. The brethren that lived in Corinth came and assembled in one place together for a specific purpose, right? That's the way we're authorized to operate in the New Testament. Now, we're not talking about the examples in the New Testament where they met in someone's home. Sometimes that was a necessity. The early Jerusalem church initially met somewhere within the confines of the temple complex, which composed a very large area, approximately 20 acres. About 200,000 people could gather there. It was called the Court of the Gentiles. Now, these meetings may have involved several different groups as the church expanded. Nevertheless, initially, at least before Jewish hostility was aroused, the outer court area was their meeting place. Acts chapter 2 verse 46. The early church in Jerusalem met in one place together for a specific purpose. Thus, the first converts to the faith, quite obviously, were not required to separate into scores of small houses. That's ludicrous to think that's what they did. But according to Lectureship Smith, until we go back to the house church concept, we haven't truly restored New Testament Christianity. Church at Jerusalem, at least initially, before persecution started, Remember Acts chapter 8, what happened after persecution? Everybody went back to their own place and went there preaching the word. Right? But until that time, on the day of Pentecost, how many people were baptized? About 3,000 were added to the initial 120. Right? Then later on in the book of Acts, it says 5,000 were baptized. Right? And then the number of disciples multiplied. And then it says multitudes were added, both men and women. Right? So just how big was the church in Jerusalem? Well, just by the hard numbers, 3,000, 5,000, it's 8,000. The court of the Gentiles is big enough to accommodate that large of an assembly. Now think about that. It's ludicrous to think that that early congregation in Jerusalem broke up and met in small groups in homes. It just doesn't teach that anywhere in the Scripture. In spite of this clear precedence in the book of Acts, one writer, in defense of the house church position, declares that New Testament church began as small group house church. And he references Colossians chapter 4, verse 15. And it remains so until the middle or end of the 3rd century. And this claim is absolutely absurd. It's false. First of all, the church did not begin in a small unit in somebody's house. It didn't begin that way. There was a minimum, as we've already mentioned, a minimum of 3,000 people added in one day to the church of Jerusalem. There could have been many more than that added later, as we've already mentioned. And it says that they were all together at least for a while, and this is reflected by the imperfect tense of where we translate our word were in Acts chapter 2 verse 44. They were there meeting for a specific period of time. We can't get around the force of the context of Acts chapter 2 verse 42 through 47. And the implication is plain that early congregation met together in one place. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and in breaking of bread and fellowship and so forth. Obviously, it's not been taught that such a large group neglected the idea of the house church movement. See, they didn't get that memo, right? They didn't get that memo there in Jerusalem. The early disciples did meet in homes at times. Of this, there is no doubt 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 19, Colossians 4 and verse 15. And mentions specifically certain households. And they met in the household of Chloe. Aquila and Priscilla, the church met in their house, so forth and so on. There's no doubt that the church met in the homes of some brethren. But there is not the slightest evidence that this arrangement constituted a binding pattern. Now, Wednesday night, Weldon's know the Bible class in the auditorium. And he was talking about posture in prayer. Well, we looked at a bunch of examples. We saw some people standing and praying. We saw some people bowing and praying, raising their hands. We saw some people prostrate. Right? Now, what if we went over there and said, well, here's an example of somebody prostrate. They were just down on the ground, prostrate. That's how we all have to do it. We might see, that's what we say about an example. We have an example. An example authorizes us to do a certain action, but it doesn't exclude other actions. That's the same way here in the 1st century. Yes, they met in somebody's home. We have an example of that, but that doesn't exclude meeting in a church building or a tent or under an oak tree. Right? We can rent a building. We can buy a building. Right? We can do all those things. Because an example authorizes an action, but it doesn't bind it, and it doesn't exclude other actions. We're commanded to assemble on the first day of the week, Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1 and 2. But where we assemble, and the time of day that we're assembled, is left to us. What we cannot change is the day that we assemble. Whether we meet in a home or a building or a high school auditorium. I've seen people meet in cafeterias at a high school before. Or some, whatever. That's left up to us to find out the best way to keep the command, the unalterable command to assemble. The rest of it is left up to us, and it's an optional matter. We can't bind one way over another. In Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, you know where they met? They met in an upper room. Are we going to bind that? We have to meet in a 2-story home. Does it have to be a 2-story house? We'll meet upstairs in maybe one of the bedrooms. See, how far are we going to go in binding these locations where they met? And the fact is, the location is optional. It's not binding. In some instances, Christians may have employed a borrowed or rented facility. Think about the circumstances relative to the daily meeting of the school of Tyrannus in Acts chapter 19 and verse 9, which appears to have included the Lord's Day worship as well as weekdays. What, do they meet in somebody's home? Or was that in a rented building or a building owned by someone? It was definitely not a home. It was considered a school of Tyrannus, and that's where the church met. To argue, as some house church advocates have done, that there was merely a temporary arrangement, 2 years, is hardly convincing. It's a 2-year arrangement. That wasn't temporary. And by the way, if the pattern is meeting in the home, and it's a sin not to meet in the home, then it doesn't matter whether the arrangement was temporary or not, it's still sinful. And there's no indication when we read through that, Acts chapter 19, that that was considered wrong in any way. In fact, they were commended for their action. Scripture does not sanction digression as a preparation for practicing the truth. Aside from that, those in that religion who were convicted to Christ or converted to Christ surely had homes that on occasion accommodated worship assemblies. Now, really, when we think about it, primitive Christianity may have been forced to meet in homes, and that might have been the expedient thing to do. But now we've progressed socially, we've progressed economically, we've progressed in a lot of ways that makes it more expedient to have a designated location where the saints meet. It's good for edification and worship. It's good for evangelism, to be known in the community, right? Now, to abandon what we're doing now and go back to house churches would really be digressing. There's no expedient for that. The only expedient today, in my opinion, this is me talking because, again, where we meet and what kind of building we meet is an option. But to go from where we are now back to meeting in somebody's home, the only exception that would make that an expedient would be if we were in an unsound congregation and we had to leave that and start over. And at the very beginning, we had no funds to rent or buy a place to meet. Then we're forced into it. Then that's our only option. So it is possible, but to just abandon what what we've accomplished and where we are and throw that away and say we're not doing that anymore simply because we don't like it and we'd rather have a small group and nobody watching over us and nobody making sure we're doing what the right thing is. You see? See, that's throwing the Bible out the window, throwing authority out the window, and just doing it because that's what you want to do, and you don't care whether it's the best thing for the church or not. This is all about me and what I want, and not what's best for Christianity. That's what the house church movement is about. I don't like the New Testament pattern. It doesn't satisfy my needs, and so we're going to go do what I want and the way I want it. So they're remaking Christianity in what they want. The house church theory would suggest that no congregation could grow larger than that which can be accommodated in a private home. Okay, how large does the family have to be before it violates this humanly imposed growth limit? In other words, we can't grow larger than what's accommodated in our home. Okay? How many can we have in your home before it's too many? Who's going to decide? See, that's an arbitrary number. Is it 10? Is it 20? Is it as many as we can fit in the room? We have as many as we have chairs for. We have a couch and a love seat and a recliner. Are we done? Can we use the kitchen dinette set to sit at? Do we have to bring in folding chairs? How many can we accommodate in a home before we have to branch out and start another house? Moreover, if the family analogy is to be pressed as a binding pattern, as our friends of the house church persuasion contend, since a family dwells in a house each day, why not insist that all the local church members reside within the same structure on a sustained basis? You know, the early church met every day. Why not just move in together? How about that? You know, if I'm going to say house church, house implies a home, home is family, and my brethren are my family, why not just, if I got 10 brethren, bring them in, we just live together. How about that?